and welcome back to EmberWrite's Expert Craft Chats. In this series, we sit down with authors, editors, and other industry experts to talk about both the craft and business of writing. Today, we are talking about outlining for all, aka how to outline no matter whether you prefer to write by the seat of your pants or meticulously plan every single scene in your novel. Today, I am joined by JT Evans. JT has been writing on and off since the age of 10, but started to take his writing seriously 20 years ago. In that time, he has written 9 novels, over 100 short stories, and numerous other pieces of work. He has 3 novels in his Modern Mythology series published, along with 3 other books in his Flashing Blades series. On the author services side of the house, he has been editing and formatting books for about 9 years and has been developing websites for over 30 years. He started Kilnar Author Services in October of 2025 and is now focused on helping other authors find success, regardless of what path they choose to take on their work. So JT, it is awesome to have you with us today. I am super excited for this discussion because it is one that I feel like is kind of a hot button topic.
Yeah, a little bit.
As fiction writing goes.
Yep. Well, hello. Thank you for having me.
All right, so without further ado, we will go ahead and get started. I think I want to begin with just a little bit of assurance for everyone that is in our audience listening, because I know there are some people that immediately heard the term outlining and just instantly tensed up because it's something that they hate doing. Can we just assure everybody that there is going to be something for everyone in this session?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's 2 phrases I like to use. One is architect, which is the people that like to outline, and discovery writers who like to discover the story as they progress through it. A lot of people call them plotters or pantsers, flying by the seat of your pants. I kind of feel that pantsers is a bit of a derogatory term, like you come in with no clue what you're doing, flying by the seat of your pants. People that discover their story as they write it, they know what they're doing, but they just dislike pre-planning. So yeah, we'll have a little bit for everybody, whether you're an architect or a discoverer.
Yeah, your terminology there reminds me a little bit of Nick Milo, who is an Obsidian note-taking expert, talks about the difference between architects and gardeners. So
yeah, gardener is another term. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right. So with that being said, I guess, why do you think this is such a polarizing topic overall? I mean, basically, what is it about outlining that makes people have such strong opinions?
There's not a lot of middle ground, honestly. I've yet to meet a writer who's like, yeah, I outline a little bit and then I discover my story from there. Most folks are solidly in one camp or the other as far as their process goes. And from my point of view, so long as you get a book done or a short story done, as long as the story is done, I really don't care how you get there. I prefer outlining, and we'll delve into that a little deeper. It just helps me organize my thoughts a little better and keep me on track. I will stray from my initial story concept if I don't have an outline to look down at and refer to figure out, what's coming next.
So I think my first question around the actual outlining part, and this is just a theory that I feel like people kind of hate outlining because they don't do any pre-work before they start outlining. They just sit down and go, okay, here's a blank page. I have to start working on this and I have to start outlining. And I feel like that puts both a lot of pressure on that as well as kind of throws you into it without ways to get control of it overall.
Right.
So, like, as far as pre-work when it comes to outlining, what would you suggest that people pursue?
So you could ask this question of 8 different people and get 10 different answers, right? So I just can speak from my perspective and what I do. So for me, before I even start outlining the story, I need a solid character concept for my point of view character or characters if it's one of those stories. I need a character concept for the character that will oppose the protagonist. So your antagonist, I got to know who they are. And I don't do a huge, worksheet and workbook for each character. Honestly, it's going to be a sentence or 3 about each character and I'm done. I just need a solid idea, but nothing too detailed. I don't document height, weight, eye color, hair color, blah, 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 all that, right? Just who are they in the story? I also need to know what the opening scene looks like and what the very last scene looks like. If I don't have those solidly in my head, I can't write the story. I got to know where I'm going and where I start. And then I like to have a good idea of the setting. The more removed from the real world the setting is, the more work I put into world building. But of course, world building is an entirely different topic.
Yeah. And your notes about like what is necessary, this actually, speaking of world building, does remind me of a session that we had with Clark Rowenson, where he was kind of talking about the access point to your world building of your story. And there are some people that can start from the world building and build out a story from there, but there are others that you may have to start with your characters first and get a feel for your characters. You may have to get a feel
Right.
for your plot before you can even start on that world building. So I think that's a really, really good example. Just for another example for everyone else, typically if I'm starting a story, I don't tend to outline very heavily. I may get a plot idea first, or I may get a character idea first. It just depends on the story. I've gotten it both ways. But I need, like JT, an idea of who the main character is, an idea of what the overarching plot might look like. I usually have to have a midpoint scene and probably an ending scene, or at least knowing what the ending is going to look like. I'm horrible with beginnings, so I rarely ever come up with like a beginning or an opening scene.
I actually have I guess it's a paranormal thriller idea for a novel. I don't know what the ending scene is. I don't know how the book ends. And I've had this idea for, 15 years, and I've done no work on it other than jot a few scant notes here and there, like I just discussed.
Mm-hmm.
And I will not even start working on it until I know how it ends. And I've struggled with that for like 15 years. Every once in a while, that book bubbles to the top of the brain and it says, hey, work on me. And I'll think about, okay, how's the book going to end? And I just don't know.
This sounds like me with one of my sci-fi projects. I have everything but an antagonist.
Oh, no.
Every time I get that, I need to work on that one. I go, well, I have to solve who the antagonist is going to be and what the conflict's actually going to be if we do that. This also kind of leads into the elephant in the room, which is there's like several hundred different outlining methods out there. Just like you mentioned, if you have 8 different people and ask them for their outlining methods, you're going to get 8 different answers. So how do you ultimately know if an outlining method is working for you or if it's actually working against you? Because that's another thing that people tend to get locked up in with outlining, is that they feel like, oh, well, if I don't do it this way, then I'm not doing it right.
So we're all in the same forest of creating stories, right? And there's a million different pathways through the forest. And some go left, some go right. There's opposing paths. I'll be going north, somebody's going south. Everybody's on their own path, but some of the paths will overlap or go in the same direction or maybe even be the same path. So you can learn from your fellow writers on what their methodology is and maybe give it a shot. Don't try it for like an evening and go, oh, this is hard, because it's going to be hard for an evening. It's probably going to be hard for a couple of weeks because you're learning a new skill. Learning a new skill takes time. Give it 2 weeks minimum 2 weeks, and see how it works for you. If you're still struggling with that new technique after a couple of weeks, step back and see where you're struggling and where you're succeeding. Take the elements of success and incorporate that into your outlining process or your writing process. And I'm a software engineer by trade. When I learn a new programming language, I give it 6 weeks. I won't code in any other language other than my new one for 6 weeks. At the end of the 6 weeks, if I'm happy with the language and what I'm doing with it and the results and the progress I'm making, I add that to my repertoire of skills.
Right.
If after 6 weeks I'm like, God, this language sucks, I just can't do it, I bail on it and I don't use it anymore.
Folks, what this ultimately comes down to is some of these methods are going to work for the way that your brain is wired. Some of these methods are not. And that is nothing to be ashamed of, because I think we as writers have such a tendency to shame ourselves over like, oh, I'm not doing the craft the right way. You know, this famous author is using Save the Cat. I'm not using Save the Cat, therefore I'm a failure. Like, that's simply not true. It is, if it works with your brain, fantastic. You found something that clicks, great. If it doesn't, and after you've given it a proper try, just like JT mentioned, give it a couple of weeks, because you don't want to just, throw up your hands and give up on it too soon. But if you've given it proper time to test it out and it's still not clicking, that's okay. Like, that's not a bad thing, and that doesn't mean you're a bad writer. And this is something that we're building EmberWrite based on. Certain things are not going to click for everybody, and certain methods you need to have some flexibility with, but you don't want to have so much that you get overwhelmed with all of the choices. So find out what works for you and really take what works, and don't be afraid to smash different methods together. That's the biggest thing, is to be flexible with this kind of stuff.
And if you attempt something, a new process, a new tool, a new technique, and it doesn't work for you, don't look at it as you failed the process. Flip it. The process failed you. because it
Yeah.
wasn't right for you. And it's not really failure. It's just not a good fit. It's not a good
Right.
match. Don't approach learning something new as success or failure. Approach it as this fits my process or this doesn't fit my process, and use the things that fit and jettison the things that don't.
And honestly, I think that's advice that every writer needs to apply to pretty much any kind of writing advice
Oh
at all,
yeah,
because I feel like it
absolutely.
applies to everything. So we'll go ahead and get a little bit more into outlining methods with that. If you are just getting started with outlining, or let's say you're trying to get over an aversion to outlining, maybe you've tried it in the past, haven't had much success, but you want to go ahead and give it another shot. Are there certain structures that you recommend starting with because they're a little bit easier to get into?
Oh, you start simple. Start with the easiest outlining method available, and that is bullet points. Whether you do it in a Word doc, handwritten journal, sticky notes, whatever you feel like you can capture the essence of your story. Just start with bullet points of high action items. Very first novel I ever wrote was over 100,000 words. I had a 4-page outline of bullet points. That was it. 4 pages, 100,000 words. That's all, because that's all I needed for that story. And obviously, so that was a mesh of outlining and discovering. So I architected the overall scaffolding of the story, and there was a lot of discovery as I went through. And one bullet point might have turned into 3 or 4 chapters. So start simple, just go with the bullet points and expand from there. And here's my advice: handwrite your first outline, because it's a different part of your brain that's sitting at the computer. Because if you're typing, you might fall into the trap of thinking, well, I'm typing, I should be typing my story, not my outline. If you set aside the laptop or desktop and just grab a journal, and I actually have my journal here that I use one of these. So I have 2 of these, they're almost full. So I'm about to buy a third. I'm going to do a little visual example. I only use half the journal. All right. So the reason I only write on the right hand side because I'm right handed. So if you're left handed, maybe you write on the left hand side, because the binding gets in my way as I'm writing on the left hand pages. And I'm going to hold up another example. My outline is on the right hand side. My random notes of I need to add something to my outline, that goes on the left hand side. See over here? So I leave it blank on purpose so that as I'm reviewing my outline, I can go back and go, oh, I need to add more detail here. And I have a whole blank page on the left side to add that detail to my outline. So it gives me a little freedom. I'm not locked in. I'm not like, oh, I've used every inch of the page, I have no room to add an extra note. And it just makes the physical process of writing easier because I'm only writing where my hand naturally fits in the open journal. So start there. That would be my recommendation.
I was going to ask too, like, how do you get over, like, with outlining, that fear of, okay, well, what happens if I'm not sticking to my outline, or I come up with new ideas or things like
Sure.
that? And I think that's a great way of dealing with it,
Oh, yeah.
because that lets you have that flexibility of, if you start writing and you say, oh, hey, this isn't working, you can actually go back in and basically redo your outline on that other page.
Oh, yeah,
So I think
absolutely.
that's super, super helpful. Another thing, folks, if you are paranoid about messing up a journal and messing up order specifically, like me, I use a lot of the disc-bound notebooks. I found those are a little bit easier to carry around than something like a binder, but they still give you that same flexibility of, oh, I need to take out a page and move it around in the journal.
Oh.
So that's been super helpful for me and has gotten to where I actually will handwrite things now because I'm not so worried about getting stuff out of order. But
Right.
I think having that blank page on the other side is super, super helpful. And let's go ahead and tackle kind of that topic on, if you start writing and you notice that you are kind of straying from your outline. I know that causes a lot of anxiety in a lot of writers, because they go, oh my God, my outline should have been set in stone and I should have followed it to the T. But oftentimes the story wants to take us somewhere else. So
Absolutely.
how do you kind of deal with getting past that concern and, like, really doing what's best for the story ultimately?
Sure. So the outline is my creation. I'm allowed to change it, right? Nobody has handed me an outline like work for hire. Like a work for hire, somebody gives you a story concept or an outline, and you've pretty much got to adhere to that. But that's a whole different beast. If you've outlined your own work and you're writing your own work, you are allowed to veer from your outline. Just so release that concern. Your outline is not some holy scripture that you have to follow or bad things happen in the afterlife, right? It's not one of those things. It's not a holy text. The second novel I wrote a scene, killed a character in the scene, and then turned the page in my journal I just held up. And on the next page, that dead character was a key component of the next page of my outline. And I was like, oops. So I stopped writing, not for like days or weeks. I just pause my writing and I look at my outline and I look at my prose and I'm like, which one is a better story? Do I need that character to not be dead for the next phase of the story? Or can I modify my outline and proceed with the prose I've already written? It was a good death. It was well delivered. So I grabbed my pen and put a big X on that page that incorporated the now dead character. And on my blank page on the left, I just jot a few notes about what his funeral scene is going to look like, right? And move forward from there. Just move forward with my story, because the prose that I had written that violated my outline, probably a poor choice of words, but you get the point, was better than the outline that I had originally written months ago.
With that, how far did those ripple effects stretch? Because when I'm having to rewrite or something like that and I make a change, I often sit there and go, oh, I'm going to have to change something that's like 6 chapters away. But for you, is there a certain point where you look at those ripple effects and you go, okay, if I do this, it's going to change so much to the story that I'm going to have to completely write something different? So how do you walk that line?
So yeah, that totally can happen. And in this case, it changed the whole remainder of the book. And we're probably about the 4/5 point of the book. So it's not like a lot of changes downstream. It's not like I was in chapter 2. I was in chapter high 20s out of 30 something chapters. So it was a few notes of emotional resonance, the people that were still alive reacting to this particular character's death. So I would read my outline and have like an interaction between two grief-stricken friends of the now dead guy. And I was like, okay, left-hand side of the page, just quick note, add grief. And I draw an arrow to the right-hand side to the scene where these two characters are interacting. And that was the extent of my notes, was just like add grief here, add grief here, add so-and-so supporting so-and-so here. Little things. It was little things. But it did have that ripple effect, as you called it, throughout the remainder of the book, to at least most of the book. It didn't really impact the entirety of the remainder of the book, but a good chunk of it, at least the immediate following chapters, the 3-4 chapters that followed that character's deaths. I don't adhere to my outlines strictly. They are guideposts along that path through the forest, like that metaphor I used earlier. So, and you're free to stray from the path. It's your path. You get to make it as you wish.
From the editor perspective, and because I know you've probably worked with a lot of different authors and things like that, what is the point when making a change like that in your outline maybe you'd advise against, just because it might trip the author up and basically lead them into decision paralysis on rewrite the manuscript 10, 15 different times?
My number of edit passes on my own stuff is in the high 20s, but each edit pass is a micro edit, but that's a whole nother topic, right? I'm looking for one specific thing to fix throughout the entire manuscript, so it's not like a developmental edit changing everything 20 something times. My big edits, I'll probably do 3 passes for the big stuff, and then focus in on micro edits for the remainder of my edit passes. But as far as advising authors, when is it going to throw analysis paralysis from your outline in a manner that will drastically change one of the main characters? Because that may introduce character inconsistency. Or if it does a major change to your setting, you may have to go back and establish why your setting is changing earlier in the book, or change all the early stuff to match what you just changed later in the book. Clark probably covered this in his magic episode with you, but if you have rules of magic and all of a sudden you need to break one of the rules of magic to keep your story moving forward, now you got to go back earlier in the book and either change the rules or set up a possibility of an exception, things of that nature. Because if you give your character 3 wishes in chapter 2, and they've used all 3 by chapter 40, and all of a sudden they need a 4th wish in chapter 40 to get out of trouble or to move the plot forward. You really can't do that. You can't use that 4th wish because you only gave them 3. Or the fix is you rewind back to chapter 2 and you search for 3 wishes, and you just make a quick little edit and make it 4 wishes and jump forward, go back to chapter 40 and, have them use that 4th wish. Because until it's published, the rules aren't set, right? Your readers don't know the rules of the magic because it's all in your head, it's all in your text. Nobody else knows, so you are allowed to make those changes. Of course, if you're writing book 17 in a series and you set up the rules in book 2, and it's already published, you're kind of locked in at that point.
Yep. So it sounds like the plot may actually be the most flexible part of your outlining process, which I think obviously is a good thing because that's usually what we're trying to do when we're outlining is get the plot nailed down.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like if we're talking about, character building, world building, setting, the stuff that really is I would say the bricks of your story, that's where maybe it pays to be a little bit more cautious. And if you're making a change, realize that there's going to be a lot that you're going to have to go back and change, both in your outline and perhaps in your story itself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I am curious if we're going to go kind of, let's say, a little bit more intermediate kind of outlining.
Okay, sure.
Style. Do you have structures that you recommend for the folks that are maybe past the bullet points? Maybe they want to get a little bit deeper. Because let's say we've got a debut author that has just published their debut and now they've got a sequel that they've got a deadline for. And obviously, these deadlines mean that we have to be a little bit more deliberate about our process. And I've heard from a lot of published authors that they said, yeah, I went through and I was a discovery writer for most of my first book. But then as I started getting deadlines and things like that, I had to become more of an architect just to keep up with the timelines.
Right. And also some publishers will take book 1 and then request an outline for book 2 and 3. So even if you are a discovery writer, now you have to do an outline because your publisher is requiring that of you. Not that they want to approve or disapprove the outline. They just want to see if you have storytelling chops to continue the story forward. And from what I've heard, if you submit an outline to a publisher who has taken book 1 and you send them outline for book 2 and they're like, cool, sounds good, you're actually not beholden to that outline. So as you're writing book 2 and you need to veer from your outline that has been quote unquote approved by the publisher, you are allowed to veer from that. I know many an author who have veered from their submitted outline. I believe it was Delilah Dawson actually submitted an outline. They approved it. She started writing it. She realized the characters didn't fit the story arc. So she didn't even ask permission. She just rewrote the outline and wrote a whole new book. And the publisher was like, yay, great book. We loved it. They didn't complain about her not following the outline.
So even in those scenarios, it's less about having something set in stone and more about just showing that you can write this outline and you do have something in mind. So your publisher is really not concerned about the content being perfect. So I think folks, like, that's a lesson to take home, that again, if you're trying to get this, my outline is set in concrete and I never need to change it. Like, if you can go back and change a book that you submitted an outline to a publisher, that should be your biggest indicator that these are flexible, living, breathing documents.
Absolutely. So. Yeah. And kind of back to your original question about, deeper into tools. With outlining, you are building a story structure for yourself. And there's probably 20 different major story structures out there and dozens more that, nobody's ever heard of. And you'd be amazed how much those story structures overlap. I've taken a fantastic class 4 times from Kevin Eikenberry about story structure. And one of its final slides is showing all these different story structures overlapping and how incredibly similar they are. So, and Kevin Eikenberry actually has a book on this. It's The Mercenary Guide to Story Structure. It's a great book, and I highly recommend it. So even though I've taken this class 4 times, I have purchased his book and read it. So it's a great book. There you go.
In those cases, it really sounds like it's less about the specific outlining method and much more about understanding the story structure overall.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's one, I don't know if it's a story structure, it's a beat structure, like beats in your story, and it's called scene and sequel, which was created by a fellow in the 1970s named Jack Bickham. That's Bickham. And I wish he had chosen a different word for sequel, because when people hear sequel, they think the second movie or the second book or things like that. In his context, a scene is where the action happens. A sequel is where the characters, usually your protagonist, react to the action that just happened. Okay? And there's 3 parts to the scene and 3 parts to the sequel. The scene has the goal, conflict, and disaster. So the goal obviously is, what does your protagonist or your point of view character in the scene want out of the scene? What is stopping them? The conflict is what is getting in their way of accomplishing their goal. And the disaster obviously is, how do things go horribly sideways out of the conflict for the character? Because if they accomplish their goal, that's the end of the book. The goal is done, right? So goal, conflict, disaster, that's your scene. And then in your sequel, you have reaction, dilemma, decision. And reaction is just what it sounds like. How does your point of view character react to the disaster that just happened? What dilemma does the disaster present to your point of view character? And based on the dilemma that they're now in, what decision do they make? And that sets up the next goal, which leads you into the next scene of goal, conflict, disaster, and it's a loop. I typically do 3 scene sequel sets per chapter, sometimes 4, sometimes 5. Rarely less than 3, because I get about 1,000 words, 1,200 words per scene sequel set, which gives me about 3,000 words per chapter. And this all sounds like math. It's not math. This is just kind of how my flow of writing works. I like chapters that run about 3,000 to 4,000 words, because that's enough meat on the bone for a chapter, and then move on to the next chapter. So that's my current outlining process. Is I have a spreadsheet where I have rows in it, where each row is a goal, a conflict, a disaster, a reaction, a dilemma, or a decision, and it moves through that cycle. And then I have bold lines and such like that to break up my chapters. And you can find all of that on my website, my author website. So that's Scene and Sequel, a quick crash course. And I learned about that from Mario Acevedo and Warren Hammond about 15 years ago at a small writers conference in Manitou Springs. And it blew my mind. I was just like, what? This is great. And I've used it ever since.
See, and I think that's a perfect example of it clicks with the way that your brain is wired. And it actually reminds me of something that we just had on our latest episode with Michael Morton, because he was talking about protagonist and antagonist relationships and how those shape the story structures. And he was talking about yes-no reversals from Schnechter. It makes sense if you know a little bit about story structure, because we have to have the action and the reaction piece, and it's kind of that push and pull that gets us through the story ultimately.
Yep. It's also called a try-fail cycle. Your protagonist tries to accomplish a goal, fails in the disaster, and then they have their sequel where they react and make a new goal, and then they try that goal in the next scene and fail in the disaster, and you just keep going.
Okay. And I think this one I'm a little bit curious on. We may be getting a little bit more into goal setting than we are talking about outlining. But I think for me with outlining, whenever we talk about scene goals and things like that, I always tend to get a little bit tripped up, because I sit here and say, okay, well, if the scene goal is attached to the larger overall plot goal, how do I make that balance and things like that? So if you have an outlining system where there is this kind of scene level goal involved, how do you kind of narrow the scope down enough to where you can make that work in the series of your outline?
Sure.
And then breaking that down into something as simple as like a scene goal. I feel like a lot of very, very discovery-driven writers, they have a tendency to get tripped up. So what is your suggestion for kind of getting that narrowed down?
So for me, in the scene level goal, what is my point of view character's most immediate need, want, or desire? Like, what do they need right now in the next 2 minutes? So we're not going to save the Empire, or we're not going to destroy the Empire and save the galaxy in 2 minutes. Now, at some point, you might get there where his next action destroys the Death Star, and that's his goal for that scene, which is great because you do need that. You do need the overarching goal of your protagonist to eventually happen in a scene. As an example, in my third Flashing Blades novel, it's a dual point of view. So I do a chapter from one point of view, next chapter is the other protagonist's point of view, and they flip back and forth. So the book opens with Styles, one of my point of view characters, tied to a chair, getting the crap beat out of him. His goal is, this is literally reading out of my outline, is get out of this chair. So that's a goal. He's got to get out of the chair, but he's tied to the chair. So it's going to be a little more difficult. So he's going to use his charisma, his words, his jibes, his jokes to maybe convince them to get out of the chair, because he can't physically get himself out of the chair. He needs the bad guys who are beating him up to untie him. And it goes from there. And, the next scene, they start beating him up because they don't like his jokes. They beat him up even more. So the next scene is lessen the beating with lies about the Onyx Gate.
Okay.
Because they're interrogating him, using beatings to interrogate him about where is the Onyx Gate. And a really bad guy comes in and cuts his face. So third scene, his goal, in all caps, really get out of the chair. And it keeps proceeding from there.
Right.
So it's micro goals. What is the most immediate need of your character? That's their goal.
Yeah. And it sounds like you don't always have to have a single scene solve a single goal, because it sounds like your main character had a main goal of get out of the chair for a good 3 scenes.
Now, for the entirety of that first chapter, he is tied to a chair. So, yeah, as a matter of fact, him being tied to the chair bleeds into chapter 3. Because chapter 2 is his partner's point of view. So we flip context to AL, who is the other protagonist of the story. And her goal is to meet up with Styles. Her opening goal of her chapter is meet up with Styles to get paid for their latest job. Because Styles was attempting to fence some items they stole. And AL was meeting up with Styles to get her part of the money. And then obviously Styles doesn't show up because he's tied to a chair. And then throughout AL's chapter, her goals are find out information about Styles. Okay, I got some information. Now let's go for where Styles was last seen and hunt for him and try to find him and go from there.
Okay. Out of curiosity, how do these micro goals kind of compare to like Styles and AL's overall goal with the novel? If you had to break that down and kind of say, okay, in the novel overall, this is kind of the conflict that they're aiming to solve, or things like that.
Sure. So these are actually setting up the overarching major goals of the story itself. Basically, the commander of the constabulary, if you will, in this fantasy setting, I call them the Grey Watch because they wear gray cloaks. So the commander of the Grey Watch wants to know where the Onyx Gate is, and neither AL nor Styles has ever heard of the Onyx Gate, let alone know where it is. However, the commander is dead set on they know where it is. He's misinformed. He's misled. So he tasks them under force of threat to go find the Onyx Gate, and that kicks off the book.
So that is your inciting incident at that point.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
This kind of ties into some of the stuff that was talked about in Michael Morton's session, because we talked about whenever you have protagonists with shifting goals, you can see how at the scene level you have these micro goals, that these things are going to shift, they're going to change. And yes, they may be building up to certain goals, but it may also be building up to a reversal. There may be a point that the characters might find out that the Onyx Gate is some kind of like Death Star doomsday kind of thing. The goal now is to make sure that we close the Onyx Gate and it never exists ever again.
There you go.
So, and it just all depends on the goals of your characters and the story that you're building. So I think that's the biggest thing, is that whenever a lot of craft advice talks about goals, they tend to talk about it in this very absolute way. That's not the way that we need to be thinking about it at all.
Well, think about your own life. You've had different goals throughout, different big goals throughout your life, right? So your characters can do the same thing.
Right. I do want to kind of touch on briefly more of the emotional side when we talk about outlining, because I know that, again, this is a topic that has a lot of, I would say, emotional baggage perhaps attached to it.
Sure.
And I think for the folks that are basically nervous about outlining, they're concerned they're going to lose the spark for their story because they feel like, oh my gosh, I've already written the thing. Why do I need to go back and, actually write the story in proper prose if I've already done this outline? So, what is your advice to that crowd? What's the best way that they can kind of get beyond that and make sure that they don't fall into that trap of feeling like they have already written their story in an outline format?
Absolutely, yeah. So, like my previous example, Stiles' goal is to get out of this chair. That is not prose. That's not even a full sentence, right? I'm not telling the story, I am bullet pointing it. So keep your outline as high level as possible so you don't feel like you're telling the story. Don't write the dialogue out in your outline. That goes in your prose. You're going to have a one line that says Stiles and AEL plot their next heist. Done. That's in the outline. And then you're going to have many, many pages of dialogue of them plotting their next heist. Also, your outline is like a skeleton. And there's very few people in this world, maybe anthropologists or chiropractors, that will walk up to a skeleton and go, man, that's a beautiful skeleton. So your outline is supposed to be ugly. It's supposed to have sentence fragments and run-ons and single words next to a bullet point or extra notes like add grief here with an arrow. It's supposed to be organized, but it's going to be ugly. It's for your consumption only. I don't know anybody that shares their outline unless they're sharing it with their editor, whether it's a freelance or at a publisher, to get feedback on the outline prior to writing the prose. But as far as sharing your raw outline with your readers, I don't know anybody that's done that. Unless it's maybe bonus material on their website or something like that after the book has been published. So the beauty of your story comes out of the prose that you create that's wrapped around that skeleton.
Right. So it is, the outline should be thought about all about just getting the bones down. And if you feel like, you're starting to write dialogue and things like that and getting to, that's the point that you're getting to in depth, and that's the point that you need to separate that out and go, okay, I need to actually move to writing the manuscript now because I'm no longer actually working on my outline. On the other side of the crowd, we have these very, very detailed architects that they love outlining more than everything else. How do you think that those folks should break out of that paralysis before they're writing, and basically this, constant reworking of the outline so they can actually get started on writing the manuscript properly?
Right. So most of the tweaks that you need to make to your outline, you are going to discover during the prose writing phase of things. If you're constantly going back and retweaking your outline for fear of writing the book, just start writing the book. It's game day at that point. Football players train all week long for their Sunday game. And when the game starts, training's done, over with. It's time to execute. Of course, they've got a pre-assigned schedule and all that. As an author, you get to work at your own pace unless you're under contract or deadline. I try not to over-outline. My outlines are typically 10% the length of the story itself, at least for my more recent outlines. So say I'm doing a short story. I'm targeting 9,000 words for this short story. It's just the concept I have in my head. I've written enough short stories. I have a gut feel of, okay, this character with this story arc and this bad guy and these concepts will land about X number of words. Just a gut feel, and I'm usually pretty close. So my gut feel for the story is about 9,000 words. My outline is about 10% of that. So my outline is about 900 words. When my outline gets to about 950, maybe 1,000 words, I'm like, okay, done. I've captured the essence of the story, and time to open EmberWrite and actually write the story.
We've talked a little bit about cases where you may shift back and forth between writing your manuscript and working on the outline. Do you have any rules of thumb to prevent yourself from basically getting, again, stuck on working on the outline? Do you sit here and say, I've got a week to do this, I've got a couple of days to do this?
Sure, yeah. So most of the time when I have to tweak an outline, it's a few minutes, honestly. Maybe an hour at most if there's a lot of cascading effects. I don't do that in the middle of my writing efforts. When I'm writing my prose, I'm writing my prose. I'm not doing research. I'll have like a small little notebook that I will just there next to the laptop. And if I need to research something, I stop typing, save my work, and then write a quick note, research Japanese wood from the 1400s. Done, right? and that's all I do. So it interrupts my writing for about 30 seconds. If I hit a point where I know I'm veering from my outline and I love what I'm doing, I will save my work, because I hit Command S so many times when I'm typing because I've lost stuff for not saving. So I save, grab my pen, grab the little notebook, and I'll do like outline colon, refer to chapter 2, scene 3, outline changes. And I won't document what the changes are in that moment. I have like a reference point of I have done something in the third scene of chapter 2 that's going to necessitate outline changes, and I'll go do those later. Maybe in the morning. My writing time is late afternoon through late night, because that's when my brain works best. I do all my business stuff and my emails and my research and other things like that. That is morning time for me because I don't have to be creative.
It's all about kind of keeping that singular focus on your writing, and that if you have
Yeah.
changes to make, just make a note that the changes need to be made,
Mm-hmm.
but save that for another time and separate that time out from your actual writing time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also, if you have a, what wood was used to make Japanese desks in the 1400s, you want to put a note in your prose so you can backfill that later. You'll do the research later, but you need a little placeholder. And this is something, I think it was Mary Robinette Kowal who taught me this. You want to put in T, K, and then whatever note, like a brief little note, like Japanese wood. Because unless you're writing weird sci-fi fantasy names, the letters TK don't show up in English together.
Yep. And that is actually something that we have a feature in EmberWrite to do those kinds of parentheticals, so that will actually pop up instead of it being, buried, or you having to go through and do Command F and find everything. That's why we built that in, is because we had so many writers that said, I use these parentheticals. So check out the manual on EmberWrite if you're interested in more on that. We have covered a lot of ground on outlining and a little bit of ground on story structure as well. So I am curious, if you could go back to talk to just got started writing JT, what would be the things that you would tell your past self about outlining?
This is actually a hard one for me because I've always been a planner and organizer. It's just how my brain works. I love making spreadsheets. It's a sickness. I love analyzing data and options. That's probably one reason I became a software engineer. My advice to myself would be I can discover stories naturally without an outline if they're brief enough. Because I used to outline like flash pieces, and those are only like 500 words. Depending on what market you're talking to, some say 500 or less, some say 1,000 or less. I would still write like a 30, 40 word outline for a 500 word story. And I can keep 500 words in my brain all at once. I don't need an outline. Just let the words flow. What might be a little bit of advice to myself.
On that topic, how do you think people need to go about figuring out where they fall on that architect and gardener spectrum? Because I feel like I fell into it just by fiat, basically from writing enough and doing it over and over again and kind of figuring out where my comfort level was. Are there ways to kind of shortcut that and make your life a little bit easier and say, this is actually going to work for the way that my brain typically works?
I don't think so. It's a lot of self-discovery and introspection and experimentation, honestly. Right. I don't know if you can answer a questionnaire that comes out and says that you score a 3 out of 20 on the Gardner Architect scale. Right. It's all self-discovery.
Which, folks, goes back to the point that we've had about there's never such thing as wasted words, because all of that is helping you feel out your writing process and understand your writing process, so that way you can improve it over time. So again, think of it as a series of small steps and small improvements. What are your top 3 books on outlining? Obviously, we have briefly cited Kevin Eikenberry's on structure that I'm sure would probably be on that list, but what are the others?
So for outlining specifically, if you want to follow my outlining process, which is a pretty sizable Excel spreadsheet, you can actually find that for free on my author website. So if you go to jtevans.net and under the tools menu, there's a novel structure option in the menu, and that will lead you to where you can download the novel structure template, which is my outlining process, and my instructions on how to use it spreadsheet, because there's multiple tabs. So there's kind of a process, and it walks you through creating a log line, using 7-point story structure, and then doing the outline itself, following the scene and sequel that we had talked about earlier. So that's all in there. And if you try to use it and it's confusing you, I do have a contact page on my website. Feel free to hit that. And we'll start a discussion via email for outlining. I'm happy to help. Two other resources. We have $1 Million Outlines by David Farland, and K.M. Weiland has a outlining your novel book and workbook that goes with it. I highly recommend both of those.
Yes, and that is actually how I originally learned to outline. So cannot recommend that enough. If you have even a leaning towards saying, oh, I think, 3-act structure / 7-point story structure might work for me, go read her stuff. It will give you a great understanding of whether that structure is a good fit for your brain. With all of that being said, where can our listeners find out more about you, your writing, and your author services?
So for my writing, I've already mentioned it, jtevans.net. If you want to find me on socials, there's a blue bar at the top that has the little social icons for, Facebook and Blue Sky and Instagram and so on and so on and so forth. So you can find me online there. It's kind of my one-stop shop, right? jtevans.net. Buy books direct for me. I have a books to read link where you can find all the various vendors that my books are available through. And then on the author services side, as many people who are authors, they also have a day job because it's kind of rough out there to, do a full-time living just off selling books. Fortunately, my day job is adjacent to writing. I have an author services company of my own. It's called Kilnar Author Services. And you can find that at kilnar.com. And I'm going to spell that for you. That's KILN as in Nancy, AR.com. And I provide editing services, book formatting services for print, ebook, and cover. I do web development for authors, and I also do one-on-one coaching for authors where you pick the topic. If it's something I know something about, we hop on Zoom, spend an hour together, and give you a little education on whatever topic you want. And if you pick a topic I know nothing about, I'll be honest with you and tell you I know nothing about that. It'd be a waste of your money and time to spend that time with me. So,
well, all of those links will be in the description on this video below, so we will have all of that available. JT, thank you for an awesome session. I hope that this helps some folks who may have been a little bit hesitant about outlining decide that maybe it's worth giving a shot and has given them some methods and some confidence to go ahead and give this a try.
Oh, you're very welcome. I had a good time. I love talking about outlining and spreadsheet.
All right, all. We will see you next time for our next expert craft chat. See you soon.